All right, so as we start to look at WebSockets, the first thing I want to show you is in the package.json, we already have a dependency on socket.io because I built out the package.json and just so it would already be there for you. If you were adding WebSockets to a web app, then you would need to add a dependency on socket.io to your package.json file, and then you would need to run that npm install command like you run the first time um, you start like a new node project. In fact, those of you who are on a different computer than you were before, when we did the Habits of Mind lab, you will need to run the npm install command from the terminal to make sure you have all the node modules as well. Um, so that gets us socket.io. There are multiple node modules for doing WebSockets in different ways. I'm focusing on socket.io because I find it one of the more straightforward and reliable ones. I could be wrong. There might be better options out there. But this is the one that I believe all of your projects use as well. Yeah. Does it? Hmm. May want to reconsider that. I don't know. We can see how it goes for you. But we'll do the socket thing. I just find this very straightforward to use. So all right. So let's start on the server side code. So before we can start sending messages from the server to the client or from the client to the server, and today we're just going to focus on how do we get a message from the server to the client, but it's exactly the same approach as we learned yesterday to send it from the client to the server as well. But before you can send any messages, you have to create the WebSocket, the connection between the server and the client. So we're going to write a little bit of code for that first. So inside of our server folder, close some of this stuff. We're going to create a new file inside of server. And we're going to create a new folder inside of server. Let's do that first. So let's create a folder called socket. Um, If we were doing something more than we're doing today, we might have several JavaScript files in here, but we're just going to create one for today, and we're just going to call it socket.js. So again, we're on the server side here. I create a folder called socket.js. Well, that's not what I want. Let's try that again. All right, now I actually have a file called socket.js. Great. All right. So we need to use the node module to get a reference to basically the class that we're going to use to create a new WebSocket server. So we'll start with that. So we're going to require and pull in a reference to the server. So we say equals require socket.io. Cool. So now we have a reference to that class. We're going to create like a new server object in a moment, and that's like our WebSocket server. But when we're communicating to the client, we need to use we'll be talking about the individual like socket itself. Okay, so there's like think of like there's the WebSocket server we're about to create, and actually let's make a variable for that. We're going to call that IO. That's our WebSocket server. And then we'll also, but when we're sending messages, we need to deal with the socket itself. So there's two different objects at play here. So we're going to create a function that eventually we're going to export from this JavaScript file and we're going to call elsewhere. This function is going to be called create socket server. And it's going to take one parameter, which is a reference to our HTTP server, which we need. I don't like that. We're going to type something different. So we're going to say IO equals new server. That's that's the class that we required from socket IO. We need to pass HTTP server to it. And then we do need to pass basically the second parameter are various properties for how we want to create our WebSocket server. Um, the only thing we're going to specify right now is connection state recovery. And we'll just set that like as an empty JavaScript object for now. Um, connection state recovery, look at that. This is what helps us like when the client like drops off and comes back, and we can like reestablish that connection. I think that looks good for that. So that's our function. So after now we've actually created our WebSocket server. So now we need to define the function that will be invoked when a client connects to the server using WebSockets. And we do io.on connection. So on means when you receive a WebSocket message labeled connection, everything is done as strings. Here's the code you run. So when we receive the connection command from a client because they're connecting to us via WebSockets, we will run this code. We'll just write it as an arrow function here. I do want to do a log because it's sometimes you're like, is WebSockets working? So we're going to actually log a user connected. This way we can look at the debug console for our server. And when we connect with the client, we'll see this printed, which is a good sign. In addition, we are going to do socket.on disconnect. So one thing to note here is when we are handling the connection, that has to be done on the WebSocket server object, right? This is io.on connection. Once we have a connection, we want to listen. Basically, think of socket.on as like adding a listener, like we're used to doing for buttons on the client side, or like we're going way back, we're used to doing with like Java to handle like, click events on a button in APCSA. So socket.on disconnect, when we're disconnected, let's log that the user disconnected. I like that. The create socket server method needs to return a reference to the WebSocket server. Let's add this as a comment. Add additional socket.on code here to handle incoming events from the client. So today we are not coding a WebSocket example where the client is going to send messages to the server. But if we were to do that, this is where we'd add it, right? So we could have socket.on and something else there, a different string that we could respond to receive that message from the client. So. All right, so we return a reference to our WebSocket server. And then let's write one more function while we're here. We need to write the function that will actually send the message from the server to the client when a new entry is created. So function emit new entry. We'll call this from elsewhere. It'll take one parameter, which is a reference to the journal entry that was just created. And we'll do io.emit. I usually make these pretty readable, like with spaces and stuff. So we'll do it like that. Cool. Oops. And then we need to export all this stuff. Create socket server and emit new entry. We'll export both of those. I messed something up. Let's see what I did here. Socket.on disconnect. I think I've got too much stuff there. There we go. All cleaned up. No? I think so. Doesn't like something. What am I still doing wrong here? I'm missing a curly bracket somewhere. All right, that looks good. That's balanced. There we go. All right, sorry about all the curly bracket stuff. I'll leave this up for a second so you can get yours to match mine. You've probably already fixed it though. Questions at this point before we go to the next file and go to the next step? All right, so now we're going to actually use then these two functions elsewhere. So let's switch to server.js. All right, so this is the code that first runs when our server or node app starts running. This is where we actually pull in like Express and everything else. This is also where we actually create the HTTP server. Okay. And you may or may not remember, I wouldn't remember. I said like when we first wrote this, there were easier ways to create the HTTP server than the way we did it here, but we did it this way because I wanted to plan ahead to um, support the WebSocket server. So that's why we wrote it like this. So we're just going to add new code here after we create the HTTP server. We are going to create a new WebSocket server object. So we're going to import the create socket server function from server socket. That looks right. And then we're simply going to call create socket server, passing as the argument the reference to the HTTP server that we just created. So we have to add these two lines of code because we have to create the WebSocket server before any clients can connect to our server over WebSockets. So regardless of what you want to emit through sockets, you have to do this part. But that's not too bad, right? Like a little bit of code here. Yeah, there's more code here to deal with the whole creating the connection thing, but still it's not overwhelming. All right. Next, let's look at emitting the message that, hey, there's a new entry to all of the clients. Obviously, the client who just created the new entry knows there's a new entry, right? Like when you create a new entry and you're in Chrome and you go back to the index page, it reloads the index page. You see the new entry. This feature is for all the other users of the Habits of Mind journaling web app who don't want to refresh the homepage. They're already on the homepage. They just want to see your new entry pop up. So let's look at how we do that. The way we do that is going to be we need to add some code to router.js where we handle the post command for create entry, right? So thinking back to like the slides we looked at for review, here's where we're writing the thing to the database. And here's where we send a message back to the client who created the entry saying, accepted, good to go. We need to actually also do the emit. So we're going to add some code between saving it to the database and responding to the client. Here, we're going to tell all of the other clients, hey, there's a new entry. So this is what it looks like. We're going to call the emit new entry method. And we need to pass an object. So here, I'll hit tab so we can see this. This won't work, right? So the variable entry is the Mongo or Mongoose entry object to send to the database, right? It's not the format we usually use to send stuff to the client, right? The things we do with EJS is a little bit different. Like if we look up here, we take the entries we get from the database and we reformat them into a new JavaScript object with the properties ID date, habit, content, right? So I'm going to actually copy this because we want really the same thing. Maybe we should create a method for this or a function for this, but we're not going to do that today. So we can't pass a mongoose object, but I can paste that code in instead. And let's just read through and make sure it looks okay. So the ID property entry.id, that's legit. Entry.date to locale date string, that gives us the date formatted as a string appropriately. Entry.habit, that looks good. And then we truncate the content. We just take the first 20 characters, we add ... to it. Wonderful. We need to import this, or did Copilot do that for me automatically? It did. Look at that. All right. So if Copilot didn't do this for you automatically, regardless, I'm going to move it up here because I like my requires more at the top or and separate from the data. So make sure you add this line if you haven't, so that you import the emit new entry function. So all we had to add, this is what's kind of cool, to tell all the clients that are currently connected to the server that there's a new journal entry. All we had to do was call the new function we wrote emit entry and pass it that new entry object. And then inside of socket.js, one line of code, hey, emit this message to all the connected clients. Hey, there's a new entry. Deal with it. So it's relatively straightforward, which I love. All right, pausing again for questions because that's the entire server side. That's all we have to do on the server. So before we jump into the client, questions about sockets on the server. All right. So let's look at index.ejs. This is what we compile, so to speak, on the server, or render on the server. That's a better verb. And then send to the client. We need to include, so on the client side, we have to include socket IO on the client side as well. And the way we do that is by adding another script tag down here. And we say the source is slash socket.io slash socket.io.js. And that's available to us because we have added the socket.io node module in our package.json. If we don't have this line of code, we can't call the WebSocket methods on the client side. Okay, this is how we get access to the variables and functions we need to do WebSockets on the client side. So every client side EJS file, which gets rendered into an HTML file that's doing WebSockets, and really the WebSockets is going to be done inside of index.js. It's not like it's done in the HTML, but we have to include this before we include our client side JavaScript that will actually receive that message. All right, we are almost done. Last file. So let's go look at the client side JavaScript. So remember, our client side JavaScript is under assets, JS, and here's index.js. Okay. We wrote some code in here and then we found a better way to do it and deleted it, but we left the file around, and we left the file around because we're going to put some code in it today. So here is where we can do the client side of the WebSockets. And we do that by saying socket equals window.io. Whoa, that's not what I wanted. Window.io. So window is that global variable that we always have a reference to. It is the window that is currently open and displayed and active in Chrome. IO gets us a reference to the WebSocket. So by including, let me switch back here. By adding this line of code, this creates the WebSocket connection for us. We don't have to write specific code on the client side to connect to the server. This does it. Um, Here, we can just get a reference to the socket that was created for us and then add our event listener to it. So here's what the event listener looks like. Socket.on, same syntax, same function as the server side. What's the message we want to listen to? Yeah, it's new entry. When we receive a new entry message through WebSockets, what do we want to do? I want to log it to make sure like the code actually gets here. And then we have to write code to update the HTML that is already rendered and displayed in Chrome to have a new HTML element that wasn't there before. So I almost like that. So let's create a new element in the document, which is of type div. We have to set some properties on it first. The class name needs to be entry. Um, that's so like the style sheet works and we can find it and things, right? But all of our journal entries displayed on the index page had a class name of entry. So we need to do that. And then we can set, yeah, we can set the inner HTML, but that's Copilot isn't quite right here. So I'm going to use the backtick so we can do all the variable stuff. All right, what does this actually look like? The way we wrote it elsewhere, I wonder, can I copy this from elsewhere? I'm going to copy. So I went to index.ejs. Here's the EJS code we have that dynamically builds the HTML for all of our entries. I'm going to copy the entire div for the entry because I don't really want to type it. And then I'm going to go back here and paste it in and we'll just clean it up. So we don't need div class entry because we already created that up here and here's the class. So I'll get rid of the first div and I'll get rid of the closing div. I do want a div for the entry date. Let me reformat this as JavaScript instead of EJS. So it's $ curly bracket to get to the variable. Entry.date. I like that. And then we have another div of class entry habit. That sounds good. That's how we did it. Let's reformat this to be JavaScript friendly. There's entry.habit. After the habit, we had the content. So div class entry content. That's good. Let's make this JavaScript and not EJS. That's what that div is like. And then we have another div for edit entry. Yep. And we want that to link to the entry ID if they want to edit the entry. So make that JavaScript friendly. Role button, class secondary, edit is the text. There's the end of the link. Cool. All right. I don't know if copying and pasting that was helpful or not. We had to make a lot of changes. This should be it. This should be all it takes. But let's find out. So I'm going to run the server and make sure the server actually runs. This is a good sign. Server is up and running. I connected to Mongo. I'm now going to run the client, and I'll need one or more of you to run the clients as well. So I need to sign in with Google. Move this to the right screen. Oh my goodness. It's making me do all the security stuff. All right, so I'll move the client up on the screen in a moment, but look at what we noticed here. Right here, oh, this is me logging in, but right here is the message, a user connected. So my client, which I'll move up here, just connected. Oh, I guess we're not running this on the same server. I don't know what I was talking about, but I can create two windows. I'm going to do that. So there's my client that connected. I'm now going to, in a different browser, also connect and sign in with Google. So now I've got multiple windows here. So I have Safari connected. I have Chrome connected. Now, if we look here, see how two users have connected? Okay, that's cool. So if I go to Chrome and say create new entry and choose today's date, and today, what did I do today? Today's Friday, thankfully. It's been rough. Let's see. Um, learning continuously. Ooh, I'm gonna make this for yesterday. I learned something yesterday about WebSockets. So learned that emitting messages via WebSockets is the same on the client and the server. I didn't know that till yesterday. So here's the interesting thing. How best to do this? All right, so here's Safari back here. When I hit submit, here's my new entry. I don't see it here. Let's see what the server says. I lost and re-got a user, but that should be okay. Let's check our client. I didn't have the console up, so I may have missed. Hmm. Refresh. All right, if I refresh, it shows up. All right, let me see if I can figure out what went wrong. All right, so if you're curious, here's what I did wrong. I'm going to try to disable this. I'm not sure if this is needed. No, that's still needed. So things I did wrong. Apparently, like I need to prepend it to the right place in the document, which makes a lot of sense. Um, so I have to actually put this new div at the beginning of our list of entries. So that's fine. I had all sorts of like extra opening, like left less than sign angle bracket stuff here because that came over from the EJS code I copied. So I shouldn't have copied the code. I should have just typed this out. So I got rid of one here. I got rid of one here. I added the missing div here, added the prepend thing here. So this file is pretty wrong. It's better now. But now if I switch and in one client, if I create a new entry, I got to sign in again. Sign in Chrome as well. All right, so if I create a new entry here, I really want this example code to work, and I hit submit. Here we are at the breakpoint. We're about to emit. We continue. We go look in Chrome. We see it printed here, and now we actually see it at the top. I really want this example to work. So several mistakes made there, but all fixed. So that's good.